But not all World War II rescue ships made it home. One of the biggest rescue operations mounted by the British became the country's greatest maritime disaster.
It was felt that this terrible tragedy would have such an effect on national morale that it needed to be kept secret. And so it was.
Amongst the horrors of World War II, there are many stories of bravery and heroism. Few, though, are as famous as the miracle of Dunkirk. The mass evacuation of British and French troops, whilst under attack from the Germans in 1940, has entered folklore. By contrast, a few weeks later, another evacuation took place from the French coast. But it's rarely spoken of. And yet, it led to the greatest maritime loss of life the world had ever known. Despite Dunkirk, 150,000 British troops and civilians were still trapped in France. They were told to make their way to a string of ports, from Cherbourg in the north to Saint-Jean-de-Luz in the south. Meanwhile, the British assembled another armada of rescue ships. They prepared for Operation Ariel. Waiting to be saved was 26-year-old Royal Engineer Walter Hirst. His unit had been building an airfield near Nantes.
My grandfather volunteered because he wanted to go back to France to finish the job that his father had begun in World War I. And all of a sudden, he's now being basically chased out of France. In June, they started to realise there was something going on. The RAF ground crew suddenly disappeared. They'd left by trucks. There was no communication between the different elements of the British forces. And it was a real shock.
Walter and thousands of other troops made their way by truck to the port of Saint-Nazaire. They arrived on June 16, 1940.
When the company, my grandfather's company, arrived in Saint-Nazaire, they discovered that there was tens of thousands of troops waiting for embarkation. So they waited overnight in gangways. There wasn't any accommodation, they just slept rough. And there was a very heavy air raid that night by the Germans. And that was their first sense of panic, first sense that there was something going wrong with the entire operation.
Waiting offshore were about 30 rescue ships. One of them was a former luxury liner, which had been turned into a troop ship, the HMT Lancastria.
The Lancastria was a Cunard ship, and her main trade was with American tourists. Initially, the Lancastria was named the Tyrrhenia, but in 1924 the company decided to change the name because the American passengers had difficulty pronouncing the name Tyrrhenia. And it's always said by mariners that changing the name of a ship brings bad luck, and so it was to prove for the Lancastria.
Lancastria was really ordered by the Admiralty to evacuate from Saint-Nazaire as many British people as she could without regard to her formal passenger carrying capacity.
Unlike Dunkirk, the German army was too far away to launch an attack from land. Instead, the great threat at Saint-Nazaire came from the air. On the morning of the 17th of June, hundreds of soldiers and civilians broke their cover, boarding small boats that took them out to the rescue ships. Walter Hirst and his unit were taken to the giant Lancastria, commanded by Captain Rudolf Sharp.
And when she arrived, the French pilot came out and addressed the captain, Captain Sharp, and said, do you realise, sir, you're putting your neck in the noose by being here? But they had no other alternative.
Walter Hirst was shocked by the numbers already on board the liner.
My grandfather's best friend happened to see the chief purser, and he stopped him. He says, you're looking really worried. He says, well, you would be really worried. With upwards of 6,000, probably 7,000 or 8,000 aboard, we don't have enough life-saving equipment for them if something goes wrong.
The exhausted troops made themselves at home. They ate breakfast, served by white-jacketed stewards, in the Lancastria's dining saloon. There was a moment to take a bath or a nap in one of the cabins. 800 RAF men were led down into a large hold where mattresses had been laid out for them. But then came what everyone dreaded.
The klaxons on the Lancastria sounded. German aircraft began an attack and initially concentrated their attack on the SS Oronsay, which was lying roughly a mile from the Lancastria's position.
The Oronsay's bridge took a direct hit. Several men were killed, but she remained afloat. But the German planes weren't finished.
The sirens on the Lancastria sounded again, signalling a second attack. And quickly after that, a German bomber, a Junkers 88, appeared low and heading from bow to stern across the Lancastria and dropped 4 500-kilogram bombs which struck the ship in rapid succession.
The 800 RAF men in the hold were killed instantly. The Lancastria started to shudder, making a noise that sounded to Captain Sharp like a wounded animal.
It would have been an indescribable horror being inside that ship. There would have been fires, there would be smoke. Very few people would have known the way out. It really doesn't bear thinking about the sheer panic and chaos of what would have happened inside that ship.
One of the survivors who I spoke to said that when he was in the water, he could see men desperately, who were trapped below decks, desperately trying to get out through the porthole windows. And he said it was just, you could see 2 or 3 men in front of each other and then behind them fire. And that image stayed with them, and they weren't getting out. These men were trapped, they were going to the bottom.
As the Lancastria began to capsize, men, women and children scrambled onto the turning hull. Some began singing, "Roll Out the Barrel," and "They'll Always Be in England." But their songs were soon drowned out as the planes returned.
Not content with sinking what was obviously a very large British troopship, the Luftwaffe came back and began strafing the men in the water and also trying to drop incendiary flares to light the oil which was escaping from the Lancastria. And it was a kind of macabre spectacle, these men sinking. And all the time the Germans were continuing the attack. All around there was men struggling, drowning.
By that point, Walter Hirst was in the water too. He was approached by another man in a state of total panic.
Perhaps he thought my granddad was dead because he was trying to stay as still as possible. He was covered in oil and he was trying to wrestle the life jacket from him. And a battle broke out between the two of them. And eventually the madman, because that's all he could be, he was out his mind as you would be, disappeared below my grandfather. And I think that affected him deeply.
The Lancastria sank in just 20 minutes. Amidst the chaos of the evacuation, the true death toll has never been confirmed. But at least 3,000 lost their lives. It may have been almost double that. But almost 2,500 did survive. Walter Hirst was picked up by a French fishing boat and was eventually returned to Plymouth for a traumatic homecoming.
And as they walked off the gangplank, there was a Royal Marines band playing to welcome the men back, and they were playing Roll Out the Barrel. And for my granddad, for many of the other survivors, they couldn't stand, they couldn't tolerate that song after it because they associated it with this horror aboard the Lancastria.
The liner that started life as a vessel for rich American holidaymakers ended it with an unenviable record. The largest single loss of life in British maritime history. Back home, Prime Minister Winston Churchill turned to damage limitation. He knew news of the disaster would have a devastating effect on the British public. Walter Hirst and his fellow survivors were forbidden to speak of it.
The country was on a kind of strange sort of high after Dunkirk, after we'd got the main British Army back. And it was felt that this terrible tragedy would have such an effect on national morale that it needed to be kept secret. And so it was.
The sinking of the rescue ship Lancastria is still rarely spoken of in Britain. But in Saint-Nazaire, there is a simple seafront memorial.
For the survivors, one of the hardest aspects was everyone talks about the Titanic, everyone talks about the Lusitania, yet the Lancastria claimed more lives than those two disasters combined. And that's hurtful. I mean, they felt that the sacrifice that their colleagues had made was not acknowledged. It was forgotten, and it was almost like an embarrassment to them.
Amidst the great losses of the Second World War,